Do we really have to stand next to this homeless trash? My stepfather sneered, his voice cutting through the soft jazz of the ballroom. He adjusted his bespoke tuxedo, scanning the 200 elite guests to ensure no one noticed me standing near the ice sculpture. My stepbrother, Bryce, leaned closer, his face twisting in disgust. "Anna, isn't this your mother's useless daughter?" he hissed at my half-sister. "Do not embarrass me. These people are above you." I stayed silent. I did not cry. I simply gripped my clutch, my fingers brushing against the encrypted flash drive holding the digital execution orders for their entire fake empire. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. Elias Thorne, the billionaire chief executive officer and the night's host, marched straight toward our table. Victor puffed out his chest, extending a hand to greet the titan of industry. Elias ignored him completely. Elias stopped right in front of me, bowed his head slightly, and kissed my hand. He glared at my stepfather with absolute contempt. "She is your billionaire boss," Elias announced. Every arrogant face crumbled. The wealth they thought they controlled was actually mine, and they had just handed me the match to burn their lives to the ground. If you have ever had to destroy a toxic family member who severely underestimated your worth, what city are you watching this execution from? Let me know in the comments below, and hit that like and subscribe button. I rewind the timeline to Monday, October 12th, 8 o'clock in the morning, exactly 4 days before the gala. The City Historical Society smelled of crumbling leather bindings and decades of undisturbed dust. I sat at a modest, scratched oak desk tucked deep within the basement archives, surrounded by towering steel shelves holding centuries of municipal records. I maintained this quiet, unassuming existence with absolute, unyielding discipline. The oversized knit cardigans, the sensible flat shoes, the meager archivist's salary, they all served as a flawless, impenetrable camouflage. They rendered me completely invisible to the parasitic greed constantly festering within my own family, while my stepfather, Victor, and my stepbrother, Bryce, spent their days parading through elite country clubs and desperately hunting for their next financial mark. I managed my massive empire entirely in the shadows. I operated Aegis Capital from the silence of this basement, routing global assets and finalizing corporate acquisitions through heavily encrypted offshore servers. I built a fortress of absolute wealth, and I kept the gate locked. The profound silence of the archive room shattered. A secure terminal, cleverly disguised as a bulky, outdated external hard drive resting beside my cataloging ledgers, emitted a sharp, singular pulse. It was a Level 1 automated threat alert, a notification triggered only when a core asset faced an unauthorized breach. I pushed aside a stack of 19th century tax documents and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner concealed on the underside of the plastic casing. The dull shell clicked. Initiating the hidden high-resolution interface, I struck the keys, executing a proprietary decryption sequence. The labyrinthine layers of military-grade encryption cascaded down the screen, parting like heavy curtains to reveal a raw data feed from my primary banking registry. A digital ledger materialized. My eyes scanned the scrolling text, immediately isolating the anomaly. A massive red flag anchored itself to a highly protected asset located deep within my private trust. It was a property lien. I leaned forward, the wooden chair creaking in the quiet room. The fraudulent document targeted a private coastal estate, a secluded expanse of stone and timber left to me by my late biological father. It was a sanctuary, a piece of quiet history completely disconnected from the sprawling, over-leveraged suburban mansion Victor currently occupied. Victor knew absolutely nothing about this estate, or so I had mistakenly believed. I dragged my cursor over the principal amount attached to the unauthorized lien, $15 million. The number sat glowing on the monitor, a glaring monument to sheer, unadulterated audacity. I extracted the full loan dossier directly from the federal banking registry. The commercial application boldly bore my full legal name. I downloaded the file and ripped open the metadata embedded within the digital signature. The electronic strokes perfectly mimicked the natural slant of my handwriting, but forensic algorithms exposed the deception in a matter of seconds. The digital notary stamp carried a certification timestamp from just 48 hours prior. They had weaponized my identity. They harvested my immaculate financial standing, my zero debt ratio, and my pristine credit history to secure a massive commercial collateral loan. I did not feel a single pang of sorrow, my heart did not accelerate, and my hands did not tremble. Betrayal from toxic people does not warrant emotional collapse. It simply demands a swift, calculated response. The discovery instantly eradicated any lingering familial obligation, replacing it with a cold, clinical focus. I shifted into my natural element as an apex predator of the financial sector. I initiated a deep background trace. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, deploying a ruthless tracing algorithm designed to hunt ghost transactions across global networks. The fraudulent loan originated from a mid-level commercial bank in Delaware, but the digital application was submitted remotely. I stripped away the basic proxy servers masking the origin. The perpetrators had utilized a cheap, off-the-shelf virtual private network to hide their location. It was the digital equivalent of hiding behind a sheer curtain. My software ripped through the superficial routing layers, isolating the exact internet protocol address used to submit the forged signature. The geolocation locked onto a sleek corporate tower situated in the heart of the downtown financial district. The internet protocol address belonged directly to the primary internal server of Victor's failing wealth management firm, Victor and Bryce. My stepfather and my stepbrother. They forged my signature to steal $15 million from my biological father's legacy. A normal victim would reach for their smartphone immediately. They would dial emergency services, shouting frantically to a dispatcher about massive identity theft, demanding swift police intervention. I stared at my phone resting silently on the scratched oak desk, and I did not reach for it. Calling the authorities would initiate a clumsy, public investigation. It would allow Victor to deploy his expensive defense attorneys. He would confidently claim it was a simple clerical error, a misunderstanding involving a convoluted family trust. He would drag the litigation out for years, shielding his fragile reputation behind endless corporate legal loopholes, ultimately paying a minor fine while maintaining his elite social standing. I refused to let him control the narrative. I refused to let the justice system offer him a plea deal. I demanded total, irreversible obliteration. I dug deeper into the raw data, establishing the exact, undeniable timeline of their forgery. I deployed a penetration protocol to quietly breach the internal network logs of Victor's firm. The data poured onto my screen, painting a vivid picture of their incompetence. The server records showed Bryce accessing my blocked credit files at 2 o'clock in the morning the previous week. He downloaded my foundational identification documents, bypassing the security questions using answers only a family member would know. They compiled the falsified application in the middle of the night. They deliberately bypassed standard underwriting protocols by leveraging Victor's long-standing industry connections with a corrupt loan officer at the Delaware bank. Pushing the fraudulent approval through the pipeline before the compliance department could flag the irregularities. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and extracted a heavy, matte black offline flash drive. The device utilized hardware-based encryption, rendering it completely impervious to external tampering. I connected it to the terminal. I systematically gathered the ammunition. I transferred the forged signature files, the unmasked internet protocol location logs, the falsified credit applications, and the raw transaction hashes of the $15 million lien. I cross-referenced the banking codes, binding the digital evidence into an airtight, irrefutable dossier of severe federal wire fraud. The progress bar crept across my monitor, glowing a steady, vibrant green. I watched the transfer complete, a quiet, definitive chime echoing in the basement archive. I safely ejected the drive, pulled the cold metal from the port, and slipped it into the deep pocket of my oversized cardigan. I shut down the hidden interface, letting the bulky plastic casing slide back over the biometric scanner. The terminal returned to its disguise as a useless, outdated piece of technology. I sat back in my wooden chair, letting the quiet stillness of the historical society wash over me once again. The initial gears of the trap were officially locked into place. Victor and Bryce thought they had cleverly secured a fortune in the shadows. They had absolutely no idea they had just signed their own federal execution warrants. And I held the pen. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Monday, the archival basement felt suffocatingly still, but my secure monitor blazed with frantic digital motion. I had spent the last 6 hours untangling the knotted financial threads Victor and Bryce had hastily tied together. They secured the $15 million. But securing stolen capital was merely the first phase of their felony. Moving it without triggering federal alarms required a level of sophistication they fundamentally lacked. My fingers hammered the mechanical keys, launching a routing tracer sequence. I tracked the digital funds as they fled the Delaware Commercial Bank. Victor attempted a classic layering maneuver. The capital bounced through a series of shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands, fracturing into smaller, seemingly innocuous deposits before reconstituting in a centralized offshore holding account in Bermuda. It was a textbook obfuscation technique, something a desperate amateur learns from a weekend seminar, not a seasoned financial ghost. I bypassed their flimsy security protocols in seconds. I breached the Bermuda ledger and isolated the outgoing wire transfer request. I needed to see their endgame. I needed to know what desperate ambition possessed my stepfather to risk a decades-long federal prison sentence. The final destination coordinates materialized on my screen. I stared at the routing numbers, my breath catching in a rare, involuntary pause. A cold, sharp laugh escaped my lips, shattering the silence of the room. The irony was not merely poetic, it was breathtakingly lethal. The $15 million was scheduled for deployment into an exclusive Tier 1 private equity fund managed by Aegis Capital. Victor and Bryce operated a failing, provincial wealth management firm. They spent their days courting local dentists and regional car dealership owners, scraping together minor commissions while pretending to rule the financial universe. But Aegis Capital represented the global apex. We handled sovereign wealth, dismantled failing conglomerates, and orchestrated multi-billion-dollar acquisitions. Securing a buy-in at Aegis meant gaining immediate, unquestioned access to the international elite. Victor and Bryce wanted a seat at the Titans table. They desperately wanted to shed their suburban mediocrity and transform into global players. To achieve this, they stole my inheritance to pay the entry fee. What Victor and his vain, impulsive son completely failed to comprehend was the foundational architecture of Aegis Capital. They read the glossy brochures. They worshipped the monolithic skyscraper dominating the city skyline. They fawned over the public board members. They had absolutely no idea that I owned the building. I held the majority shareholder proxy. I founded Aegis Capital. They were attempting to launder stolen money through my own personal fortress. I reached for my encrypted satellite phone, a device physically disconnected from any standard cellular grid. I punched in a dedicated 13-digit sequence. The line connected immediately, bypassing receptionists and executive assistants. "Nicole!" A deep, resonant voice answered on the first ring. "Elias Thorne, the Chief Executive Officer of Aegis Capital." To the financial media, Elias was a ruthless, brilliant visionary, a man who moved markets with a single press release. To me, he was a trusted enforcer, the fiercely loyal shield who managed the public face of my empire while I manipulated the strings from the shadows. "Elias, access the pending applications queue for the new Tier 1 fund," I instructed, my tone completely devoid of pleasantries. "Filter the submissions for a $15 million buy-in originating from a Bermuda holding company." I heard the rapid clacking of a keyboard echoing through the receiver. A brief silence followed. "I see it," Elias confirmed, his voice dropping an octave. "The originating entity traces back to Victor's wealth management firm. Your stepfather submitted a bid." "He did not just submit a bid," I corrected. "He forged my signature and leveraged my private coastal estate to secure the collateral. He is attempting to buy a partnership at Aegis using my stolen inheritance." A heavy, dangerous silence hung on the line. Elias possessed a lethal temper when it came to corporate compliance, and he harbored a deep, abiding disgust for my toxic family. "I will freeze the application," Elias stated, his tone hardening into cold steel. I will dispatch our internal security division and hand the raw data directly to the federal authorities. They will be in handcuffs before sunset. No, I commanded. Do not stop the transfer. Elias paused. Nicole, if we accept those funds, we are temporarily holding illicit capital. We are securing the murder weapon, I countered, leaning forward in my wooden chair. If you reject the application, Victor panics. He scrambles to return the money, claims an administrative error, and hides behind his defense attorneys. I do not want him warned. I want him trapped. I shifted my gaze back to the monitor, watching the pending status of their wire transfer pulse on the screen. Approve the preliminary compliance check, I instructed. Flag the application internally, but allowed the $15 million to clear directly into our escrow accounts. Send Victor an automated confirmation. Let him believe he succeeded. You want them to complete the wire fraud, Elias murmured, catching the grim trajectory of my strategy. I want them to walk willingly into federal jurisdiction, I affirmed. Lock the funds in escrow. Do not let a single cent move. Prepare a formal invitation for Victor and Bryce to attend the Friday night gala. Tell them they will execute the final partnership contracts in person. I terminated the call. I kept my eyes locked on the primary terminal. 3 minutes later, the pending status icon on the Bermuda transfer shifted. The corporate firewall at Aegis Capital parted, executing Elias's override command. A vibrant, glowing green progress bar materialized across my monitor, mapping the influx of capital. I watched the bar fill, 20%, 50%, 80%. The system emitted a sharp, high-pitched chime. Transaction complete, escrow locked. Victor and Bryce had just crossed the Rubicon. By moving the forged capital across international borders and depositing it into a corporate escrow account, they elevated their crime from domestic identity theft to massive, irrefutable federal wire fraud. The digital footprint was now cemented permanently into the Aegis mainframe. They actively handed me the indisputable proof of their own felony. I isolated the raw transaction hashes. I pulled the specific alphanumeric identifiers tying the Delaware loan to the Bermuda shell, and finally to the Aegis ledger. I exported the data blocks into a specialized forensic auditing program. My hands worked with methodical, surgical precision. I stripped away the superficial banking jargon, formatting the undeniable evidence into a flawless, color-coded executive dossier. I created separate tabs for the forged digital signatures, the unauthorized property lien, the offshore routing nodes, and the final escrow lock. I built a digital guillotine. Victor and Bryce operated under the delusion of supreme control. They spent their entire lives treating me like a useless burden, a silent archivist unworthy of their elite society. They believed they could trample my boundaries, steal my legacy, and buy their way to power without consequence. I saved the completed dossier to my encrypted offline drive. I shut down the terminal, plunging the monitor into absolute blackness. I picked up my bag and walked out of the historical society. Victor expected me at his suburban mansion tomorrow evening for a mandatory family dinner. I planned to sit at his table, eat his food, and watch him celebrate the construction of his own federal cage. Tuesday, October 13th, exactly 7 o'clock in the evening. I guided my 10-year-old sedan into the sweeping circular driveway of Victor's suburban mansion. The sprawling stone facade loomed against the darkening autumn sky. 4 massive pillars flanked the mahogany double doors, a desperate architectural attempt to project generational wealth. 2 leased European sports cars sat parked near a cascading fountain. The entire property reeked of highly leveraged debt, a fragile house of cards held together by Victor's sheer desperation to remain relevant within the city's elite social circles. I cut the engine, grabbed my worn leather tote bag, and walked toward the entrance. Helen opened the door before my knuckles could strike the wood. My biological mother wore a pristine silk blouse and a heavy diamond tennis bracelet. She did not offer a greeting. She did not reach out for a hug. Her eyes instantly swept over my frame, snagging on my gray wool cardigan and sensible flat shoes. She let out a long, theatrical sigh, the sound scraping loudly against the silence of the marble foyer. "Nicole, I specifically asked you to dress appropriately," Helen muttered, her fingers fluttering up to adjust her heavy pearl necklace. Victor has important clients dropping by later to celebrate. You look like you just crawled out of a damp basement. Try not to embarrass us tonight. I stepped past her, maintaining an absolute blank expression. I did not defend my wardrobe. I did not apologize for my existence. I walked straight past the grand staircase and entered the formal dining room. The space featured a massive crystal chandelier casting harsh light over a custom mahogany table, set for 5. Victor stood at the head of the table. He wore a velvet smoking jacket, sloshing amber liquid into a heavy crystal tumbler. He raised the glass, inspecting the expensive scotch with profound self-satisfaction. Bryce slouched in the chair to Victor's right, aggressively tapping the face of his oversized luxury watch. Anna sat opposite him, holding her left hand up to the chandelier to admire the light catching the facets of her massive diamond engagement ring. "Take a seat, Nicole," Victor commanded, refusing to even glance in my direction. "Try not to scuff the hardwood." I took my designated spot at the far end of the table, maximizing the physical distance between myself and the patriarch. I placed my tote bag on the floor, slipping my right hand smoothly into my coat pocket. My thumb traced the edge of my smartphone. Finding the tactile side button, I pressed it twice, initiating the encrypted audio recording application. The device vibrated once against my thigh, a silent confirmation. The trap was actively listening. Servants emerged from the kitchen, placing plates of rare steak and roasted vegetables in front of us. Victor slammed his crystal tumbler onto the table and leaned forward, bracing his knuckles against the polished wood. "This is a monumental week for this family," Victor announced, projecting his voice as if addressing a crowded boardroom. "By Friday night, we are officially closing a $15 million partnership with Aegis Capital. We are leaving the minor leagues entirely behind. The Tier 1 fund is ours." Bryce scoffed, slicing into his bleeding steak with aggressive force. "It is about time. I am sick of dealing with small-time dentists and local franchise owners. Aegis puts us at the global table. We will be managing sovereign wealth by next year." Anna swirled her dark red wine, her lips curling into a cruel sneer. "My fiancé's parents will finally stop looking down their noses at us," she proclaimed. "When they find out we are partnered with Elias Thorne, they will practically beg us to manage their trust funds." Bryce turned his gaze toward me, malicious delight dancing in his eyes. "Did you hear that, Nicole? $15 million. I know numbers that high confuse a simple archivist. How much does the Historical Society pay you these days? $40,000 a year. You could work for 3 centuries and never see a fraction of the capital we move in a single afternoon." I picked up my silver fork, speared a piece of asparagus, and chewed slowly. I swallowed. I did not break eye contact with my porcelain plate. I offered them nothing but profound silence. Helen picked up her linen napkin and dabbed the corners of her mouth, feigning maternal concern. "Bryce, leave your sister alone. It is not her fault she lacks ambition. We just have to accept that she will always be a financial burden to this family. She has no drive. She just wants to hide among dusty books and live in the past." Anna rolled her eyes, pointing her wineglass directly at me. "She does not just hide, she drains our resources." "Victor, why do you even invite her to these dinners? We are stepping into a new echelon of society. We cannot have her hovering around in those hideous sweaters, dragging down our aesthetic." Victor raised his hand, silencing his children. He reveled in the role of the benevolent, untouchable patriarch. "Let her stay. She needs to understand how the real world operates," Victor said, his tone dripping with thick condescension. He took another long gulp of scotch, the alcohol loosening his tongue and inflating his towering ego. "You see, Nicole, success in the financial sector requires bold, decisive action. It requires a willingness to bypass the bureaucratic red tape that holds mediocre people back." Under the table, my phone captured every single syllable in high definition. I set my fork down, resting my hands neatly in my lap. "What kind of bold action, Victor?" I asked, keeping my voice soft, perfectly mimicking the tone of a clueless, intimidated subordinate. Victor laughed, a harsh, arrogant bark that echoed off the dining room walls. "You have to know how to maneuver capital. Nicole, the banks are full of cowards hiding behind underwriting protocols and compliance checks. When I needed the collateral for the Aegis buy-in, I did not wait for committee approvals. I bypassed standard underwriting entirely." He leaned back in his chair, gesturing expansively with his empty glass. "I leverage specific private assets. I bypass the sluggish verification processes, and I push the approval directly through a contact at the Delaware branch. You have to take what you need, forge the path yourself, and force the capital to flow. The bank does not need to look closely at the signatures when they see my firm's letterhead." He had just explicitly bragged about bypassing federal banking regulations, leveraging unauthorized assets, and committing signature fraud on a hot microphone. He thought he was delivering a masterclass in corporate dominance. In reality, he was reading his own federal indictment aloud. Bryce pointed his steak knife at me. "Take notes, Nicole. That is how winners operate. Maybe if you possessed a fraction of Dad's intellect, you would not be living in a miserable little apartment, but you do not. You are weak." I picked up my linen napkin, wiped my mouth, and placed it neatly beside my plate. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped against the floor, instantly silencing the table. I stood up, retrieving my tote bag from the floor. "Thank you for the meal, Helen," I said, my voice eerily calm, completely devoid of anger or humiliation. I looked directly at Victor, meeting his arrogant gaze. "And thank you for the insight, Victor. It was incredibly illuminating." I turned my back on them and walked out of the formal dining room. Bryce muttered an insult about my pathetic attitude, but I did not stop. I crossed the marble foyer, pulled open the heavy mahogany doors, and stepped out into the crisp October night. I slipped my hand into my coat pocket and pressed the button on my phone. Halting the recording, I immediately uploaded the pristine audio file directly to my encrypted offline drive. I walked down the sweeping circular driveway toward my 10-year-old sedan. The night air filled my lungs, cool and sharp. The psychological suppression they attempted to inflict inside that dining room felt utterly insignificant. They mistook my silence for submission. They mistook my restraint for weakness. They possessed absolutely no idea that the silent archivist they just mocked was currently evaluating the exact dimensions of the federal penitentiary cells they would soon occupy. I slid behind the steering wheel, started the engine, and drove away from the sprawling, over-leveraged mansion. The thrill of the hunt crystallized in my chest. The coiled spring was locked tight, and the release was going to shatter them completely. Wednesday, October 14th, exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. I bypassed my desk at the Historical Society entirely. Instead, I drove to the subterranean data center located 3 floors beneath the towering glass skyscraper that housed the global headquarters of Aegis Capital. The elevator doors parted, revealing a sterile, climate-controlled corridor bathed in stark white light. I bypassed the security desk, walking directly to the reinforced steel door at the end of the hall. I pressed my palm against the biometric scanner and leaned into the retinal reader. A green laser swept my iris, the heavy internal locking mechanism disengaged with a solid, echoing thud. I stepped into the core server room. The air inside dropped 20 degrees, chilled by massive industrial cooling units required to keep the proprietary mainframe from overheating. Row upon row of towering black server racks hummed with immense, concentrated power. This room served as the central nervous system of my empire. I took a seat at the primary administrative terminal, a curved expanse of black glass and brushed steel. I placed my fingertips on the keyboard and logged directly into the Aegis Capital executive backend. I bypassed the standard user interface, dropping straight into the raw, unfiltered data streams of our global operations. I navigated to the pending acquisitions queue. There, sitting at the top of the executive review list, was the application submitted by Victor's wealth management firm. They requested a formal partnership and a buy-in to our highly restricted Tier 1 equity fund. I opened their submitted dossier. Victor had packaged the application in layers of aggressive corporate jargon, highlighting his firm's supposed regional dominance and steady year-over-year growth. To a standard underwriter, the polished charts and projected revenue graphs might have looked promising, But I do not read graphs. I hunt the underlying data. I deployed a forensic diagnostic tool across their submitted balance sheets. The software ripped away the polished formatting, exposing the raw, unedited ledgers. I began cross-referencing their claimed assets against external banking registries, parsing the numbers with surgical precision. The facade crumbled within minutes. Victor and Bryce were not operating a successful, expanding firm. They were piloting a burning aircraft straight toward the ground. I pulled up the acquisition history from the previous fiscal year. Bryce, acting as the primary acquisition director, had spearheaded a series of catastrophic commercial real estate investments. He funneled a massive percentage of their operating capital into purchasing a string of failing suburban strip malls, banking heavily on a municipal zoning change that ultimately never materialized. The properties hemorrhaged cash. The commercial mortgages anchored to those dead investments triggered brutal, suffocating margin calls. I watched the red deficits bleed across my monitor. The math laid their desperation bare. The $15 million they stole by forging my signature and leveraging my private coastal estate was not intended for a strategic expansion. It was a life raft. It was a frantic, 11th-hour patch designed to plug a massive hole in a sinking ship. Without the Aegis Capital partnership, without the illusion of global liquidity that our name provided, Victor's firm faced absolute, unavoidable insolvency within 30 days. They were completely bankrupt. I leaned back in the ergonomic leather chair, the low hum of the server racks vibrating through the floorboards, the puzzle pieces locked together with devastating clarity. Victor's arrogant bragging at the dinner table the night before took on a new, pathetic dimension. He was not a conqueror bypassing red tape. He was a cornered animal gnawing its own leg off to escape a trap. He needed the Aegis Capital brand to assure his panicked creditors. He needed my stolen $15 million to clear the entry fee. I leaned forward, pulling the keyboard closer. The time for observation concluded. The execution phase required immediate action. I opened a blank, highly encrypted communication template bearing the official Aegis Capital corporate letterhead. I bypassed Elias Thorne's inbox and assumed direct executive control of the outgoing message. I began to type. I did not draft a standard approval. I crafted a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. I utilized the exact corporate buzzwords and sycophantic phrasing that arrogant, narcissistic men like Victor craved. I commended his firm's exceptional financial acumen. I praised their bold market strategies and their innovative approach to capital management. I typed that the executive board of Aegis Capital recognized their immense potential and deemed their portfolio a perfect fit for our exclusive Tier 1 fund. I moved to the final paragraph, setting the physical parameters of the trap. I formally invited Victor, Bryce, and their immediate family to attend the upcoming Aegis Capital Autumn Gala, scheduled for Friday night in the grand ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel. I specified that Elias Thorne would personally oversee the final contract signing during the event, welcoming them into the global partnership in front of our most elite stakeholders. I reviewed the text. It was flawless bait. It offered them salvation, immense public validation, and the ultimate validation of their towering egos. I attached the preliminary acceptance documents, digitally sealing them with the Aegis corporate watermark. I moved my cursor over the send button. I thought about the decades of quiet disdain. I thought about the constant mocking of my modest lifestyle, the sneering remarks about my lack of ambition, and the profound, sociopathic entitlement required to steal a deceased man's estate from his only daughter. I pressed the key. The transmission sent. I immediately launched a tracking protocol on the outgoing data packet. The software generated a secondary window on my monitor, displaying a live feed of the email's trajectory. The packet bounced through our encrypted outbox, crossed the city's fiber optic network, and landed precisely in Victor's primary corporate inbox. I watched the screen, regulating my breathing. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes. A sharp, crisp ping echoed from the computer speakers. The screen flashed a bright, undeniable green. Read receipt confirmed. The tracking software verified the exact terminal that accessed the message. It was Victor's desktop computer in his corner office. Seconds later, a secondary ping registered. He forwarded the email to Bryce. A third ping confirmed Bryce opened the attachment. I stared at the glowing green notifications, picturing the chaotic scene currently unfolding in their mediocre suburban office. I envisioned Victor leaping from his leather chair, his face flushed with manufactured victory. I pictured Bryce storming into the room, slapping his father on the back, shouting in sheer, unadulterated euphoria. They were celebrating. They were likely popping a bottle of expensive champagne. Believing their ruthless financial maneuver had succeeded, they believed they outsmarted the federal banking system, outplayed the compliance boards, and secured their permanent place among the global financial elite. They possessed absolutely no comprehension of the reality surrounding them. They did not secure a partnership. They swallowed a hook laced with deadly poison. I closed the tracking window and locked the terminal. The heavy steel door sealed behind me as I exited the freezing server room, stepping back into the warm, sterile corridor. The digital guillotine was fully assembled, the blade cranked to the absolute highest notch. Victor and Bryce were currently marching up the wooden steps, cheering their own impending execution, completely unaware they were walking into a meticulously engineered slaughterhouse. Thursday, October 15th. The digital clock on my kitchen counter shifted to exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I sat at my small laminate dining table, reviewing the final security perimeter schematics for the upcoming Aegis Capital Gala on my encrypted tablet. The quiet hum of the refrigerator provided the only ambient noise in the modest, beige-walled apartment. A sudden, violent pounding against the front door shattered the silence. The heavy blows rattled the cheap brass fixtures. I locked the tablet screen, slipped the device into my pocket, and walked to the entryway. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Bryce shoved his way across the threshold before I could step aside. He marched into the small living room, wearing a sharply tailored, aggressive pinstripe suit. He turned and kicked the wooden doorstop with the heel of his polished leather shoe. The heavy door swung wildly, slamming against the drywall and cracking the pristine white paint. Anna strutted in directly behind him. She carried a pristine designer handbag, the leather stiff and brand new, undoubtedly purchased on credit anticipating the Aegis Capital partnership money. She wrinkled her nose, looking around the small living room as if the air itself carried a contagious disease. "Pack your bags, Nicole," Bryce commanded, his voice echoing in the confined space. He did not ask, he dictated. I stood near the cracked drywall. Folding my arms across my chest, I offered him a blank, unblinking stare. Bryce paced across the scuffed hardwood floor, gesturing expansively with his hands. "Victor is finalizing the Aegis Capital partnership tomorrow night. The compliance boards require a massive injection of immediate liquidity to finalize the Tier 1 escrow accounts. He is consolidating his portfolio. He is liquidating minor assets." Bryce stopped pacing and pointed a rigid finger directly at my face. "Victor owns this entire building through a blind corporate shell company. He just signed the deed over to a commercial developer this morning. The demolition crews arrive on Monday. You have exactly 10 minutes to gather your pathetic belongings and vacate the premises." I stared at my stepbrother, processing the sheer, breathtaking magnitude of his lie. Victor did not own this building. Victor did not possess the capital to purchase the pavement outside this building. He fabricated an elaborate, ruthless fiction designed to execute a brutal psychological eviction. He relied entirely on my assumed financial ignorance. Believing he could terrify me onto the street with a few aggressive corporate buzzwords, he wanted to strip away my fundamental security, ensuring I remained entirely focused on basic survival rather than disrupting his impending victory at the gala. Anna leaned against the doorframe, inspecting her freshly manicured nails. She tilted her head, offering me a smile dripping with venomous pity. "Do not look so shocked, Nicole," Anna sneered, dropping her hand to adjust the strap of her new designer bag. "You knew you could not sponge off our family forever. The real world is harsh. Try looking up a local homeless shelter. I hear the city opens up extra cots during the autumn months." Bryce checked his oversized luxury watch, tapping the crystal face impatiently. 9 minutes. Grab your cheap sweaters and get out. I need to secure the locks before the developers arrive." A normal person facing a sudden, Aggressive eviction would demand documentation. They would demand a legal notice, a signed eviction order, or proof of ownership. They would scream, threaten to call the police, and fight desperately to maintain their sanctuary. I did not argue. I did not utter a single syllable of defense. I dropped my arms, turned my back on their arrogant, sneering faces, and walked down the short hallway into my bedroom. I bypassed the closet filled with drab, oversized wool cardigans and sensible slacks. I knelt beside the modest wooden bed frame. I reached underneath the mattress and retrieved a heavy, reinforced leather duffel bag. I pulled open the bottom drawer of my nightstand, pushing aside a stack of mundane historical society paperwork, my thumb pressed against a concealed biometric scanner mounted flush against the back panel of the drawer. A hidden steel lockbox clicked open. I reached inside and extracted 3 heavy, matte black hard drives. These encrypted drives contained the master ledgers of Aegis Capital, the access keys to multi-billion-dollar offshore accounts, and the flawless forensic dossiers detailing every single federal crime Victor and Bryce had committed over the past 96 hours. I stacked the drives carefully inside the leather duffel bag. I added my encrypted tablet, a velvet pouch containing my true identification documents, and a small, heavy biometric security key. I zipped the thick brass teeth of the duffel bag closed. I did not pack a single piece of clothing. I abandoned the cheap furniture, the faded rugs, and the entire fabricated existence of the quiet, struggling archivist. I shed the disguise completely, leaving it dead on the bedroom floor. I gripped the leather handles of the duffel bag, hoisted the heavy weight onto my shoulder, and walked back down the hallway. Bryce and Anna stood in the kitchen, opening cabinets and mocking the generic brand groceries lining the shelves. They turned as I entered the living room. Bryce crossed his arms, a victorious, cruel smirk stretching across his face. He believed he had broken my spirit. He believed he had successfully crushed the final remaining obstacle standing between him and global financial supremacy. I stopped directly in front of him. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the brass apartment keys, and held my hand over his. I dropped the keys. The metal clinked sharply against his open palm. I did not say a word. I looked him dead in the eye, offering a stare so cold and devoid of human emotion that his victorious smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. I stepped around him, walked past Anna, and crossed the threshold. I pulled the heavy front door shut behind me, leaving them standing in the silence of the empty apartment. I left them to savor their hollow, fabricated victory. I walked out of the building and stepped onto the bustling city sidewalk. The crisp October wind hit my face, carrying the scent of roasted coffee and exhaust fumes. I did not walk toward my 10-year-old sedan parked down the street. I left the vehicle sitting at the curb. I raised my hand and hailed a passing black town car. I slid into the plush leather back seat, placing the heavy duffel bag next to me. I instructed the driver to head toward the financial district, specifically naming the towering gold glass luxury hotel dominating the downtown skyline, the exact venue scheduled to host the Aegis Capital Gala tomorrow evening. The town car merged into the heavy afternoon traffic, putting miles of physical distance between myself and the parasitic toxic waste of my family. The charade officially concluded. The psychological suppression ceased. The car glided to a smooth halt beneath the sprawling, gilded porte-cochere of the luxury hotel. I stepped out, bypassing the valet line and the eager bellhops. I walked through the towering revolving doors and entered the massive marble lobby. Crystal chandeliers cast brilliant light over the polished stone floors. The air smelled of fresh lilies and expensive cologne. I ignored the standard registration queue, walking deliberately toward the secluded VIP concierge desk tucked behind a frosted glass partition. The concierge, a man in a flawless charcoal suit, looked up with a polite, practiced smile. "Good afternoon, madam. How may I assist you today?" I unzipped the side pocket of my duffel bag. I bypassed the standard credit cards. I extracted a solid black titanium card bearing no numbers, only a magnetic strip and an embedded microchip, alongside my true, unredacted passport. I slid the metal card and the passport across the polished marble counter. The concierge picked up the card, swiped it through a discreet terminal, and glanced at the monitor. His professional smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of absolute rigid reverence. His posture snapped perfectly straight. He looked at my passport, confirming the name, and then looked at me, lowering his voice to a hushed, deferential whisper. "Welcome back, ma'am," he said, handing the documents back with trembling precision. "The penthouse suite has been prepared according to your standing corporate directives. The private elevator bank is ready." He did not offer me a room key. The biometric security system programmed into the penthouse required only my retinal scan. I nodded, took my documents, and walked toward the private elevator bank concealed behind a mahogany panel. The steel doors parted silently. I stepped inside. Pressing the button for the top floor, the elevator ascended rapidly, leaving the lobby far below. The doors opened directly into the sprawling penthouse suite. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the entire city skyline. The Aegis Capital headquarters towered in the distance, a monolith of glass and steel piercing the clouds. I walked into the master bedroom and dropped the heavy leather duffel bag onto the pristine white duvet. I unzipped the main compartment and extracted the encrypted hard drives, lining them up with mathematical precision on the mahogany executive desk overlooking the city. I walked to the expansive walk-in closet. A sleek black garment bag hung suspended in the center of the illuminated space. Delivered earlier that morning by my executive assistant, I unzipped the protective fabric. Inside hung a razor-sharp, floor-length black gown. It was immaculate, devoid of unnecessary embellishments, projecting absolute lethal authority. It was not just a dress, it was my armor. I stood in the center of the penthouse, surrounded by the physical manifestation of my true empire. Victor and Bryce thought they had evicted a helpless archivist. They completely failed to realize they had just forced an apex predator to abandon her camouflage and step directly into the light. I mentally locked the final sequence of the trap. The execution orders were signed. Tomorrow night, the guillotine would drop. Friday, October 16th, the digital display on the penthouse console shifted to exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. Sunlight flooded through the floor-to-ceiling glass, warming the polished marble floor. I stood near the window, holding a porcelain cup of black coffee. The dark liquid burned the back of my throat, sharp and grounding, far below. The city crawled with morning traffic, a tangled grid of metal and exhaust across the skyline. The Aegis Capital headquarters pierced the clouds, a monolith of glass and steel casting a long shadow over the financial district. The silence inside the suite was absolute. The quiet shattered. My personal smartphone, resting on the granite kitchen island, vibrated. The device danced across the stone surface, emitting a relentless, staccato buzz. I did not rush. I took another slow sip of coffee, lowered the cup, and walked across the room. I picked up the device. The screen flooded with cascading notifications. The alerts multiplied by the second, stacking over each other in a chaotic digital avalanche. Anna had initiated her preemptive strike. She understood the gravity of the upcoming gala. She knew Victor and Bryce needed absolute perfection to finalize their perceived partnership with Elias Thorne. She viewed my existence as a volatile variable, a potential embarrassment that could derail her ascent into the upper echelons of the city's elite, especially with her wealthy fiancé watching. To neutralize the threat, she deployed the only weapon she possessed: social annihilation. I unlocked the screen and opened the primary family group thread. Anna had hijacked the narrative. She authored a sprawling, meticulously fabricated essay, dripping with feigned familial sorrow. She claimed I suffered a severe, violent psychological break the previous afternoon. She wrote that Victor, acting with immense paternal mercy, attempted to secure psychiatric help for me, but I responded by embezzling petty cash from his wealth management firm. According to Anna's fiction, Victor possessed no choice but to evict me from the apartment to protect the family's liability. She painted herself as the traumatized sister, mourning my tragic, rapid descent into madness. The lies did not stop within the family circle. I tracked her digital footprint across socialite networks. She forwarded the fabricated narrative to exclusive country club message boards, charity committee forums, and elite gossip chains. She sowed the poison deep into the soil of the city's aristocracy, ensuring that if I dared to emerge from the shadows, I would face immediate, unified revulsion. The screen flashed again. A direct text message from Anna breached the notification banner. I tapped the alert. She sent a screenshot of a prominent socialite forum. The captured thread displayed dozens of replies from wealthy heirs and society wives, expressing their disgust and offering Anna their shallow prayers. Beneath the image, Anna typed her ultimatum. "Consider this your final warning, Nicole. You are radioactive. Every important person in this city knows you are a thief and a lunatic. If you even think about showing your face near the Aegis Gala tonight, I have strict orders with the hotel security to drag you away in handcuffs. Stay in the gutter where you belong." A standard victim would crack under the pressure of a coordinated smear campaign. They would frantically draft rebuttals, begging extended family members to believe the truth. They would cry, hyperventilate, and ultimately surrender. Retreating into the exact isolation the abuser engineered, I locked the screen. The display went entirely black, cutting off her toxic venom. I placed the phone face down on the granite counter. I felt no anger. I experienced zero humiliation. Anna fought with water pistols, entirely oblivious to the thermonuclear payload currently hovering over her head. She believed controlling the gossip of idle socialites equated to wielding actual power. I turned my back on the phone. I picked up my porcelain cup, drained the remaining black coffee, and walked into the master bedroom. The 3 heavy encrypted hard drives sat on the mahogany executive desk, positioned exactly where I placed them the previous afternoon. I retrieved my specialized laptop from my leather duffel bag, setting it squarely in the center of the workspace. I lifted the screen. The machine booted instantly. I bypassed the standard operating systems, booting directly into a secure, heavily encrypted partition utilized explicitly for high-level corporate auditing. I connected the first hard drive to the terminal. I did not navigate to a public police tip line. I bypassed local jurisdictions entirely. I routed my connection through a secure virtual private network, masking my location, and accessed the highly restricted portal for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's white-collar crime division. The federal interface materialized on my screen, austere and demanding. I opened a new submission file. My fingers flew across the keyboard, mapping the digital nodes. I did not pause to blink. First, I extracted the commercial loan application from my hard drive. I uploaded the file. I attached the metadata reports, highlighting the fraudulent digital notary stamps and the forged signatures Victor and Bryce utilized to leverage my coastal estate. I populated the submission fields with the exact timestamps of the forgery, directly linking the digital footprints to the primary server inside Victor's wealth management firm. Second, I accessed the offshore tracing data. I uploaded the visual flowcharts mapping the stolen $15 million. I attached the raw alphanumeric transaction hashes, proving the capital bounced from a Delaware commercial bank, through the Cayman Islands, and into the Bermuda holding company. I documented the final wire transfer directing the illicit funds into the Aegis Capital escrow accounts. I provided the federal agents with a flawless, illuminated roadmap of international wire fraud. Finally, I retrieved the audio file recorded under the dining room table on Tuesday evening. I enhanced the audio frequencies, isolating Victor's arrogant, booming voice. I uploaded the recording, creating a dedicated transcription file highlighting the exact moment he boasted about bypassing standard underwriting protocols to secure his unauthorized liquidity. I reviewed the compiled dossier. It possessed no gaps. It contained no circumstantial theories. It offered absolute, irrefutable mathematical proof of severe federal crimes. I navigated to the priority status menu. I flagged the entire submission for immediate, escalated executive review, utilizing a specific classification code reserved for massive, active securities fraud involving prominent financial institutions. I moved the cursor over the final submission icon. Anna believed she possessed the authority to threaten me with hotel security. She believed she controlled my destiny through country club gossip. I pressed the key. The progress bar illuminated the screen, pushing a bright, steady green line from left to right. I watched the data packets leave my machine, piercing through the encrypted tunnel, flying directly into the primary servers of the federal government. The system chimed. A rigid, bureaucratic confirmation message materialized on the monitor. Providing an alphanumeric receipt for the uploaded payload, I severed the connection. I ejected the hard drive. I closed the laptop. The domestic side of the trap was officially armed. The federal agents possess the evidence. They possess the motive. They possess the complete timeline. By the time the sun set, the warrants would be drafted, signed, and distributed to the tactical strike teams. I stood up from the mahogany desk and walked back toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked down at the sprawling city. Victor, Bryce, Helen, and Anna were currently moving through the streets below, visiting salons, picking up tailored suits, and celebrating their fabricated triumph. They possessed less than 10 hours of freedom remaining. Tonight, the facade would collapse, the federal handcuffs would lock, and the silence of the archivist would break forever. Friday, October 16th. The grandfather clock inside the penthouse suite struck 8 o'clock in the evening. I stepped into the private elevator, bypassing the bustling main lobby entirely, and descended directly to the mezzanine level overlooking the grand ballroom of the hotel. The steel doors parted in absolute silence. I stepped out, planting my heels against the carpeted balcony, and observed the battlefield stretching out below. The ballroom radiated a suffocating level of extreme, concentrated wealth. Crystal chandeliers the size of small vehicles hung suspended from the frescoed ceiling, refracting harsh, brilliant light across the polished marble floor. A string quartet occupied an elevated mahogany dais, playing a seamless, classical melody that floated above the ambient chatter. Dozens of waiters in crisp white jackets moved through the crowd with mechanical precision, balancing silver trays laden with crystal champagne flutes and imported caviar. I wore the stark floor-length black gown. The fabric possessed no sequins, no intricate lace, no distracting embellishments. It clung to my frame, absorbing the chandelier light rather than reflecting it. I wore no necklace and no earrings. I carried a simple, structured clutch containing nothing but my identification. The sheer, brutal simplicity of my attire rendered me entirely invisible. I became a ghost, haunting my own empire. I gripped the marble balustrade, my eyes locking onto the primary entrance doors 2 floors below. At exactly 8:15, the heavy brass doors at the far end of the ballroom swung wide. The maitre d' stepped aside, clearing the threshold. Victor crossed the entry plane first. He paused deliberately, granting the 200 elite guests permission to gaze upon him. He tugged the satin lapels of his bespoke tuxedo, thrusting his chest forward. He surveyed the room, his eyes wide with ravenous, unadulterated greed. He believed he owned this building. He believed the stolen $15 million sitting locked in the Aegis Capital escrow account granted him absolute dominion over the city's financial aristocracy. He breathed in the air of the ballroom as if inhaling absolute victory. Helen flanked his right side. She gripped a metallic evening clutch, raising her chin at a sharp, unnatural angle. She wore a suffocating aura of heavy perfume and a gold silk dress that trailed heavily against the marble. She swept her gaze over the immediate attendees, internally calculating their net worth. Searching the crowd for faces she deemed worthy of a physical greeting, she ignored the staff completely, treating the waiters as invisible fixtures of the architecture. Bryce charged through the doors next, completely lacking his father's practiced, albeit fragile, restraint. Bryce wore a velvet dinner jacket that screamed of newly acquired arrogance. He immediately spotted a cluster of senior executives from a rival equity firm standing near a cocktail table. Bryce abandoned his parents, marching directly toward the group. He thrust his hand forward, invading their physical space without a secondary thought. The executives stiffened. Their polite smiles vanished instantly. One man reluctantly accepted the handshake, his posture rigid, his feet subtly shifting backward to break the proximity. Bryce did not notice the blatant revulsion. He clapped the executive hard on the shoulder, laughing loudly at a joke he initiated, entirely oblivious to the silent, suffocating contempt radiating from the men he desperately attempted to impress. Anna brought up the rear, completing the toxic procession. She paraded through the brass doors, her movements slow, calculated, and exaggerated. She wore a crimson gown with a plunging neckline, a garment purchased entirely to serve as a backdrop for the jewelry adorning her skin. A massive diamond collar choked her neck, matching the heavy, faceted bracelets weighing down both of her wrists. The stones caught the chandelier light, flashing brilliantly as she turned her head. She purchased the entire collection on rapidly expiring revolving credit less than 48 hours ago, aggressively leveraging the anticipated Aegis Capital partnership money to secure the stones. She preened, twirling a lock of her hair, desperately hunting the perimeter of the room for the gaze of the local society columnists and event photographers. I descended the curved marble staircase, slipping seamlessly from the mezzanine into the bustling crowd on the main floor. I hugged the perimeter, navigating the edges of the ballroom where deep shadows clung to the heavy velvet window curtains. I moved behind the backs of the elite guests, entirely undetected. Victor gravitated toward the center of the room, anchoring himself beside a towering ice sculpture carved into the shape of a soaring falcon. He intercepted a passing waiter, snatching 2 champagne flutes from the silver tray without offering a nod of acknowledgement. He thrust one glass into Helen's hand and began holding court. He cornered a pair of regional bank presidents. I tracked his movements from 20 yards away, remaining perfectly still against the wall. His mouth operated at a frantic, desperate pace. He gestured aggressively with his free hand, chopping the air to emphasize his fabricated triumphs. He leaned in, invading the banker's personal space, projecting his voice over the string quartet. He boasted about his superior financial acumen, his unmatched liquidity, and his ironclad, intimate relationship with the executive board of Aegis Capital. The bank presidents exchanged uneasy glances, shifting their weight from foot to foot. They remained trapped by social convention, forced to endure the suffocating wave of his towering hubris. Victor drowned in his own delusion, happily drinking the champagne funded by my stolen inheritance. I continued my perimeter walk, my eyes swept over the heads of the guests. Searching the elevated dais situated near the main presentation podium, I found Elias Thorne. The chief executive officer stood entirely still, a granite pillar amidst a sea of swirling, desperate sycophants. Men and women thrust heavy business cards toward his chest, jockeying aggressively for a fraction of his attention. Elias ignored their outstretched hands. He kept his own hands clasped firmly behind his back, his posture rigid, his dark eyes scanning the ballroom with the clinical, unfeeling detachment of a military commander surveying a combat zone. I stepped slightly away from the velvet curtains, our eyes locked across the massive expanse of the grand ballroom. The ambient noise of the string quartet and the clinking crystal faded into static. I offered a subtle, deliberate tilt of my head. Elias held my gaze. He delivered a single, imperceptible nod. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket, retrieved his smartphone, pressed a single button, and immediately returned the device to his pocket. He did not look at the screen. I shifted my gaze back toward the main entrance. The heavy brass doors pulled shut, the thick metal latches engaged with a dull, resonant thud that vibrated through the floorboards. The maitre d' stepped away, vanishing into the corridor. 2 men wearing inconspicuous dark suits stepped in front of the brass handles, crossing their arms over their chests. Their jackets bulged slightly at the hip. I glanced toward the service exits lining the eastern wall. Identical men in dark suits anchored those doors, planting their feet shoulder-width apart, establishing an impenetrable physical barricade. The federal agents held the lobby. The tactical lockdown officially engaged. Nobody would leave this room until the execution concluded. The psychological tension compressed to its absolute physical limit. The coiled spring locked tight, the pressure threatening to crack the marble beneath my feet. The ballroom transformed into a sealed vault, and the air grew incredibly thick with the promise of impending destruction. Friday, October 16th. The ornate gold clock mounted above the main ballroom bar displayed exactly 8:45 in the evening. The timeline caught up perfectly to the opening hook, closing the loop on the preceding 96 hours of calculated restraint. I stopped hiding. I peeled myself away from the heavy velvet curtains, shedding the shadows completely. I planted my heels firmly against the polished stone, letting the sheer, cold rage dictate my stride. I marched directly across the center of the ballroom, parting the sea of elite guests, moving straight toward the ice sculpture where my family stood. My stark black gown absorbed the brilliant chandelier light. I moved with the silent, uncompromising momentum of a gathering storm. The regional bankers and society heirs instinctively stepped backward, clearing a wide, unobstructed path across the marble floor. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the towering, carved falcon. Victor noticed my approach when I breached the 20-foot perimeter of his self-appointed throne. The transformation was instantaneous and visceral. He halted mid-sentence, dropping his aggressive hand gestures. He blinked rapidly, struggling to process the sight of the woman he had falsely evicted yesterday, standing in the epicenter of his anticipated financial coronation. His face flushed, a violent, mottled crimson. He snapped his head left and right, scanning the faces of the 200 elite guests. Terrified a society columnist might witness the proximity of the family pariah, he took a hostile, rapid step forward, attempting to block me from the wealthy executives he had cornered. "Do we really have to stand next to this homeless trash?" Victor sneered, his voice a harsh, venomous whisper cutting through the ambient soft jazz. He grabbed the satin lapels of his bespoke tuxedo, yanking them downward in a frantic, jerky bid to restore his manufactured composure. He shifted his weight, attempting to project physical dominance. Bryce abandoned a nearby conversation and rushed to his father's side, recognizing the immediate threat to their carefully constructed image. He planted his feet, looming over my frame. He turned his head, locking his hostile eyes with my half-sister. "Anna, isn't this your mother's useless daughter?" Bryce hissed, his chest heaving with arrogant indignation. He pointed a rigid finger toward the mahogany exit doors. "Do not embarrass me. These people are above you. Get out before I signal security to drag you onto the pavement." Helen turned her back entirely. She raised her crystal champagne flute to her lips, refusing to acknowledge the confrontation, prioritizing her social standing over basic maternal instinct. Anna smirked, tracing the edge of her heavily leveraged diamond collar. She leaned against the ice sculpture table, reveling in the public execution she believed they were currently conducting. She assumed her fabricated smear campaign had driven me to a desperate, pathetic plea for inclusion. I stood my ground. I did not retreat a single inch. I did not shed a tear. And I offered absolutely zero verbal defense. I simply gripped my structured clutch, the stiff leather pressed against my palms, safeguarding the encrypted flash drive that held the digital execution orders for their entire fake empire. I absorbed their venom, letting it fuel the final sequence of the trap. A sudden, palpable ripple of movement swept through the ballroom. The regional bankers standing near Victor widened their eyes. Looking past my shoulder, the crowd physically retracted, pulling away to clear a wide, undisputed corridor across the marble floor. Elias Thorne approached. The chief executive officer of Aegis Capital strode through the parted sea of guests. He moved with the undeniable, crushing gravity of a man who controlled billions of dollars. He did not smile. He did not acknowledge the eager murmurs of the sycophants lining his path. His dark, calculating eyes remained fixed strictly on our location. Victor's panic instantly evaporated, replaced by a blinding, intoxicating surge of greed. He assumed the titan of industry was marching over to finalize the $15 million partnership in front of the city's financial aristocracy. He assumed this was his ultimate victory. Victor shoved past Bryce, desperate to claim the spotlight. He puffed out his chest, stretching his spine to maximize his height. He plastered a sycophantic, radiant smile across his face and thrust his right hand forward, eager to greet the man he believed held the keys to his global ascension. "Elias, an absolute honor to finally formalize our arrangement," Victor projected, his voice booming across the immediate radius, ensuring the surrounding executives heard his perceived triumph. Elias did not break his stride. He did not lower his gaze. He completely ignored the outstretched hand. Victor's hand hung suspended in the empty air. His radiant smile froze, fracturing at the edges as Elias bypassed him entirely. The chief executive officer treated my stepfather like an invisible, insignificant speck of dust. Stepping smoothly around the extended arm, Elias stopped directly in front of me. He planted his feet, brought his right hand across his tailored jacket, and bowed his head in a gesture of profound, unyielding respect. He reached forward, taking my right hand gently in his. He lowered his lips, kissing the back of my knuckles with absolute reverence. The ballroom inhaled a collective, jagged breath. Elias released my hand, stood to his full height, and turned slowly. He locked his cold, predatory gaze onto Victor's confused, trembling face. Elias did not whisper. He projected his voice with lethal clarity, ensuring the acoustics of the grand ballroom carried every single syllable to the 200 guests watching the spectacle. "She is your billionaire boss," Elias announced. The impact of the words hit the family like a physical shockwave. Victor's jaw dropped. The muscles in his face gave out completely, sagging under the weight of an impossible reality. His arm, still hovering in the air from the rejected handshake, fell limp against his side, striking his thigh with a dull thud. The color drained from his skin in a rapid, visible wave, leaving a sickly, translucent pallor. The illusion of his supremacy shattered into a million jagged fragments. He realized the quiet archivist he had mocked for decades commanded the man he desperately worshipped. Bryce physically staggered backward. His polished leather shoes slipped against the slick marble. He collided heavily with the ice sculpture table, the impact rattling the carved falcon. He gasped, clutching his chest, his eyes darting frantically between my stark black gown and Elias Thorne's deferential posture. The arrogance evaporated from his features, replaced instantly by primal, unadulterated terror. He realized the $15 million he forged my signature to steal was currently sitting inside a vault I owned. Helen choked on her wine, her fingers spasmed violently. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her grip. It plummeted toward the floor, striking the hard marble with a sharp, violent crack. The glass shattered, launching sparkling shards and vintage wine across the polished stone, staining the hem of her expensive silk dress. Anna shrieked, jumping back to avoid the splashing liquid. She clutched her diamond collar, her mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. Her preemptive smear campaign, her country club gossip, her threats of hotel security, all of it crumbled into pathetic, laughable dust. She stared at the architect of the financial system she desperately sought to infiltrate, realizing she had just declared war on a sovereign power. The sharp crack of the shattering glass severed the ambient noise of the event. On the elevated mahogany dais, the lead violinist flinched, lowering his bow. The cellist stopped playing. The string quartet died in a discordant, abrupt halt. The music stopped. The 200 elite guests froze. Business magnates lowered their drinks. Politicians halted their conversations. The entire room snapped their attention to the epicenter of the ballroom. They stared at the shattered, hyperventilating facade of my family. They witnessed the city's most obnoxious, aggressive wealth managers instantly reduced to terrified, shivering imposters. The silence grew heavy, suffocating, and absolute. I remained perfectly still. I did not gloat. I did not laugh at their collapsing reality. Nor did I offer a theatrical monologue. A true apex predator does not waste energy on taunts when the kill is already secured. I stepped forward, my heels clicking sharply against the marble, crossing the spilled champagne. I closed the physical distance between myself and Victor. I looked my stepfather dead in the eye, watching the sheer panic dilate his pupils. The psychological suppression he had inflicted upon me for years officially died in the shadow of my gaze. I dropped my silence. "Victor," I stated, my voice echoing cold, clinical, and perfectly calm across the frozen ballroom. "The final audit of your firm is complete." I turned my back on my stepfather. I did not wait for his sputtering response or his frantic attempts to rationalize the impossible reality crashing down upon his shoulders. I walked deliberately toward the elevated mahogany dais anchoring the front of the grand ballroom. The sea of regional bankers, tech magnates, and society heirs parted, creating a wide, undisputed corridor across the marble floor. They watched my progression in absolute, breathless Silence. Elias Thorne stepped off the platform, granting me unobstructed access to the primary presentation podium. I climbed the 3 carpeted steps. I gripped the edges of the polished wood, anchoring my weight against the solid structure. I leaned forward, bringing my lips mere inches from the microphone. I tapped the steel mesh twice. The sharp, percussive thuds reverberated through the towering surround sound speakers, commanding the undivided attention of the 200 guests. I raised my right hand, catching the gaze of the audiovisual technician stationed in the elevated control booth at the rear of the hall. I dropped 2 fingers, delivering the execution signal. The massive digital arrays flanking the stage, previously displaying the glowing gold Aegis Capital crest, flickered. The corporate branding vanished instantly. High-resolution scans of commercial bank records flooded the screens, illuminating the darkened corners of the ballroom with a stark, unforgiving white light. The sudden shift in illumination cast harsh, elongated shadows across the faces of my family, a collective, jagged gasp rippled through the audience as the attendees processed the highly classified financial documents, projected 20 feet high. I spoke into the microphone, my voice projected steady and even, a lethal, calculated cadence designed to strip away their dignity line by line. 4 days ago, the executives of this wealth management firm attempted to secure a massive injection of capital, I announced, the words slicing through the stagnant air. They sought a $15 million commercial loan. However, their firm possessed zero liquidity. To generate the required collateral, they targeted a secluded coastal estate. This property remained completely isolated from their own failing portfolio. It was an estate left to me by my biological father upon his death. I pressed a button on the podium console. The digital displays magnified the second page of the banking dossier. The bright white screens highlighted the dense legal text of the collateral agreement. They did not ask for permission. They did not negotiate a familial loan, I continued, maintaining my icy, objective tone. They harvested my identification, bypassed standard underwriting through corrupt channels, and weaponized my pristine credit history to steal a dead man's legacy. I advanced the presentation again. A magnified image of the signature line materialized behind me. The digital ink mirrored my exact handwriting, a flawless visual forgery spanning the entire width of the stage. Observe the authorization, I instructed the silent crowd. To the naked eye, this document appears legally binding, but forensic extraction of the metadata reveals the precise mechanics of this theft. A secondary window popped open on the screens, displaying lines of raw code, timestamps, and unredacted Internet Protocol addresses. The digital notary stamp carries a certification mapping directly to the primary servers inside Victor's office. He and his son, Bryce, sat at their desks in the middle of the night and fabricated this application. They forged my signature to steal $15 million. I looked down at the ballroom floor. The psychological toll of the public audit manifested physically across the shattered remnants of my family. Bryce braced his hands against his knees, his chest heaving as if he had just sprinted 10 miles. He stared at the marble floor, praying the polished stone would crack open and swallow him. He slowly turned his head, looking back at the group of rival executives he had aggressively accosted just 30 minutes prior. The executives glared back at him with unadulterated disgust. Bryce realized his corporate ambitions were permanently obliterated. He clamped his hands over his face, unable to bear the burning weight of their collective judgment. Anna collapsed backward, her spine hitting the ice sculpture table. The carved falcon wobbled dangerously under the sudden impact. Her chest spasmed in rapid, shallow jerks. She clawed frantically at the heavy diamond collar, choking her neck, her manicured nails scratching her own skin as she struggled to pull oxygen into her restricting lungs. She hyperventilated. The realization that her borrowed jewels, her designer gown, and her entire fabricated social status were funded by federal wire fraud shattered her fragile composure completely. Her knees buckled. She slid down the edge of the table, hitting the floor in a crumpled heap of crimson silk, weeping hysterically into her hands. Victor broke his frozen posture. The towering arrogance he carried into the ballroom abandoned him entirely. He stumbled forward, leaving his wife and children behind. His polished shoes slipped on the champagne-slicked marble, causing him to stagger awkwardly toward the dais. The crisp lines of his bespoke tuxedo wrinkled as he hunched his shoulders, diminishing his physical presence. "Nicole, stop," Victor gasped, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate plea that echoed horribly through the quiet room. He reached his hands toward the podium, palms facing upward in a pathetic gesture of surrender. Sweat poured down his forehead, stinging his eyes. "Turn the screens off, please. This is a massive misunderstanding. I can explain the trust structure. We can fix the paperwork. Do not do this in front of these people." I did not blink. I did not acknowledge his frantic, sweaty negotiations. I looked past his outstretched hands, ignoring his pathetic pleas entirely. I reached out and tapped the podium console for the final time. The massive screens shifted, replacing the forged signatures with a cascading web of offshore routing numbers. Bright red lines connected a Delaware commercial bank to the Cayman Islands, bouncing across the Atlantic to Bermuda, and terminating directly into a secure Aegis Capital holding account. "They believe they possessed the sophistication to launder stolen capital," I announced, my voice amplifying over Victor's whimpers, forcing the 200 guests to focus on the undeniable data. "They funneled the $15 million through an international maze, attempting to wash the funds before depositing them as a buy-in for our Tier 1 equity fund." I paused, letting the silence crush the final remnants of their pride. "They routed my stolen inheritance directly into a vault I own. The $15 million currently sits permanently frozen within the Aegis Capital escrow network. They successfully trapped their own stolen money." Victor let out a strangled, hollow groan. He dropped to his knees, hitting the bottom step of the dais. He buried his face in his hands, realizing the profound, catastrophic stupidity of his actions. He had attempted to defraud the very entity he desperately sought to join. Handing the indisputable proof of his felony directly to the victim he spent decades abusing. I swept my gaze across the crowd. The business magnates, politicians, and society elites stared at the projected evidence, their faces hardened into masks of pure revulsion. The elite society Victor desperately worshipped now viewed him as a radioactive contaminant. I forced the audience to look down at the trembling men cowering before the stage. "They stand before you tonight not as visionaries," I concluded, my tone dropping to absolute zero, driving the final nail into their coffin. "They are not global financial players. They are incompetent, desperate thieves." I do not stop at identity theft. A single felony provides insufficient leverage for total obliteration. I keep my hand firmly anchored to the podium. I look down at my stepfather, who remains kneeling against the bottom step of the dais, his breath hitching in ragged, erratic gasps. I press my thumb against the console pad, advancing the presentation. The projected screens flicker, dismissing the offshore routing maps of the stolen $15 million. A new cascade of internal corporate ledgers illuminates the ballroom, bathing the 200 elite guests in harsh white light. These documents drill directly into the foundational operating accounts of Victor's wealth management firm, exposing the rotten core of their daily operations. I shift my gaze from Victor to Bryce. My stepbrother is currently braced against the ice sculpture table, his chest heaving under his velvet dinner jacket, desperately trying to mentally calculate his personal legal exposure. The $15 million secured through forgery served a singular purpose, I announce, my voice cutting cleanly through the suffocating silence of the grand ballroom. It was intended to purchase their partnership with Aegis Capital. However, Victor and Bryce faced a much more immediate, fatal crisis long before they submitted their application to our Tier 1 fund. I highlight a column of massive, bleeding red deficits cascading down the projected balance sheets. My stepbrother spearheaded a catastrophic commercial real estate acquisition strategy over the past 12 months, I state, detailing his failures with absolute clinical detachment. He aggressively purchased failing suburban retail centers, utilizing highly leveraged corporate debt. When the municipal zoning changes, he banked on failed to materialize. The commercial mortgages matured. His creditors issued brutal, immediate margin calls. The firm became officially, undeniably insolvent. Bryce grips the edge of the table. His knuckles turn stark white. He shakes his head in rapid, microscopic twitches, silently begging me to stop broadcasting his profound professional incompetence to the city's financial aristocracy. I ignore him completely. I tap the console. The screen split. The left side displays the massive margin calls. The right side displays a series of unauthorized internal wire transfers originating from highly restricted accounts. Victor lacked the operational liquidity to cover his son's catastrophic losses, I project, forcing the room to look at the routing numbers. To mask the margin calls and artificially inflate his balance sheet before submitting his application to my company, Victor bypassed external lending entirely. He looked inside his own firm. I zoom in on the origin points of the internal transfers. The account titles clearly designate them as protected fiduciary trusts. Victor drained the escrow accounts of his most vulnerable wealth management clients, I reveal, letting the sheer malice of the act settle over the audience. He targeted the retirement portfolios of elderly investors who entrusted him with their life savings. He authorized the illegal commingling of protected client funds with his primary corporate operating accounts, utilizing the stolen capital to plug the holes in his sinking ship. A visceral collective shudder rips through the ballroom. In this room, surrounded by titans of industry, cutthroat acquisitions and aggressive takeovers are considered standard practice, but the violation of fiduciary duty, the active, malicious theft of client escrow funds, is the ultimate, unforgivable heresy. It is the action of a desperate, bottom-feeding criminal. The regional bankers Victor cornered earlier physically recoil. They wipe their palms against their tailored trousers, as if the mere proximity to my stepfather transferred the contagion of his crimes. The elite guests murmur in absolute, unadulterated horror, their faces twisting with profound revulsion. I grip the edges of the mahogany podium, delivering the final classification of their actions. Victor and Bryce committed massive, undeniable federal securities fraud. The words strike Bryce like a physical blow to the chest. The reality of his situation crushes the breath out of his lungs. Identity theft might yield a plea deal in a lenient court, but defrauding elderly clients out of their retirement trusts triggers the full, wrathful weight of the Securities and Exchange Commission. It guarantees decades in a federal penitentiary and a permanent, humiliating ban from the global financial sector. His career, his freedom, and his identity evaporate in a fraction of a second. Bryce's knees buckle. The velvet fabric of his trousers stretches as he crashes heavily onto the polished marble floor. The impact echoes sharply. Snapping the tension in the room, he tears frantically at the collar of his shirt, popping the top button, desperate to pull oxygen into his restricting airway. The toxic, fragile loyalty that bound my family together instantly shreds into meaningless confetti. Survival instinct overrides decades of shared arrogance. Bryce scrambles backward on his hands and knees, scrambling away from the ice sculpture and away from his father. He raises a violently shaking hand, extending a rigid finger, and aims it directly at Victor. "I did not authorize those transfers," Bryce screams, his voice cracking into a panicked, feral shriek that tears through the ambient acoustics of the ballroom. Saliva flies from his lips. His eyes bulge with absolute terror. "He did it." Victor handled the escrows. He forced me to sign the compliance waivers. He told me he would cut me out of the firm if I did not mask the margin calls. He made me do it. Bryce throws his father directly into the jaws of the federal trap, sacrificing the patriarch in a pathetic, hyperventilating bid to save his own skin. Victor spins around, abandoning his kneeling posture on the dais steps. The sheer, venomous rage contorts his face, transforming his features into a grotesque mask of fury. The man who spent his life projecting refined aristocratic grace lunges across the marble floor like a rabid animal. "You incompetent parasite," Victor roars, his voice tearing at his vocal cords. He charges toward his own son, his hands curling into tight fists. You caused the margin calls. You bankrupted this family with your pathetic, idiotic investments. You signed the ledgers. Bryce, your name is on the transfers. Helen screams. She drops her metallic clutch, abandoning all pretense of high society decorum, and throws herself directly into the line of fire. She steps between the charging patriarch and her cowering son. She shoves Victor backward with both hands, striking his chest hard enough to halt his momentum. "Do not you dare touch him," Helen shrieks, her carefully sprayed hair falling into her face, her gold silk dress sweeping through the puddle of spilled champagne. She defends her golden child, turning her ferocious, desperate hostility upon her husband. "You are the founder of the firm. You were supposed to protect us. You ruined everything." Victor. Anna remains crumpled on the floor near the ice sculpture, entirely ignored by her warring parents. She clutches her heavily leveraged diamond collar, weeping hysterically, rocking back and forth as she watches her family tear each other to pieces in front of the city's most powerful people. The 200 guests witness the grotesque, animalistic unraveling of the fake empire. The elite society members do not intervene. They do not offer assistance. They move in absolute, synchronized repulsion. The business magnates, the politicians, and the heirs physically step backward. The movement is fluid, a collective, silent retraction from the toxicity bleeding across the floor. They pull their spouses away, they turn their shoulders, creating a wide, empty perimeter. They isolate my family completely. Victor, Helen, Bryce, and Anna are left marooned in a harsh, illuminated circle in the dead center of the grand ballroom, surrounded by a wall of impenetrable, silent disgust. I stand perfectly still at the elevated podium, looking down at the chaotic, screaming spectacle. I do not raise my voice to silence them. I do not interrupt their mutual destruction. I simply watch the parasites consume each other, weaponizing my silence while the federal guillotine hovers inches above their necks. The chaotic, screaming match between my biological mother, my stepfather, and my stepbrother echoed against the vaulted frescoed ceilings, a pathetic symphony of mutual destruction. Yet, my attention shifted away from their brawl. The perimeter of elite guests maintained their rigid, suffocating isolation, except for one singular figure. Anna's wealthy fiancé separated himself from the wall of silent, disgusted aristocrats. He represented the absolute pinnacle of her manufactured success, the sole heir to a massive shipping conglomerate, a man whose surname possessed the power to permanently elevate my family into the highest echelons of the city's hierarchy. He did not look at the projected screens displaying the federal wire fraud. He looked solely at Anna. He stepped forward, crossing the invisible boundary separating the contaminated family from the pristine society. Anna stopped weeping into her hands. She looked up, her mascara running in thick, dark, jagged streams down her pale cheeks. A spark of desperate, pathetic hope flared in her eyes. She believed her partner would rescue her, shield her from the federal fallout, and whisk her away from the public execution. She reached her hands out toward him, her heavily leveraged diamond bracelets clinking together. He stopped exactly 5 feet away from her crumpled form. He did not extend a hand. He did not offer a word of comfort. His face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated revulsion. He looked at the crimson silk, the borrowed diamonds, and the woman who had tied his immaculate family name to a massive federal money laundering investigation. He reached up and gripped the collar of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled the garment off his shoulders in a sharp, definitive motion, refusing to wear the attire he had specifically customized for this celebration. He draped the jacket carelessly over a nearby high-top cocktail table. Then, he raised his left hand. He grabbed the matching platinum engagement band resting on his ring finger, a custom piece Anna insisted they both wear to project their unified wealth. He twisted the cold metal, pulling the heavy ring loose over his knuckle. He did not hand it to her. He did not speak a single syllable of closure. He dropped the ring. The platinum band hit the glass surface of the cocktail table with a sharp, piercing crack. The sound vibrated through the silent ballroom, a definitive, percussive termination of their entire future. He turned on his heel. He walked toward the heavy mahogany exit doors, his strides long and deliberate. He parted the crowd, exiting the ballroom without looking back a single time. Anna watched his retreating figure, the reality of her total social and romantic obliteration shattering her mind. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, reaching desperately toward the empty space he left behind. "Wait!" Anna shrieked, the sound tearing at her vocal cords. "Wait, please, I swear I did not know about the money." The heavy brass doors swung shut, sealing him in the lobby. Anna's elbows gave out. She dropped to the marble floor, her chest hitting the cold stone. She collapsed completely, turning into a crumpled heap of ruined crimson silk. Her fingers curled into tight fists, beating against the floorboards as she sobbed violently. The high society circles she worshipped, the wealth she craved, and the aristocratic future she fabricated entirely evaporated, leaving her a humiliated, abandoned suspect in a massive federal investigation. The sound of her hysterical weeping broke the spell over the rest of the family. Victor stopped lunging toward Bryce. Helen stopped shoving her husband. They turned their heads, watching Anna completely disintegrate on the floor. Victor slowly turned his gaze away from his ruined daughter. He looked up at the digital screens, still projecting his federal securities fraud, the commingled client escrow accounts, and the forged commercial loan documents. He looked at the silent, impenetrable wall of business magnates, tech founders, and politicians who now viewed him as a radioactive contaminant. Finally, his bloodshot eyes tracked back to the elevated mahogany dais. He looked at me. He realized the brawl with his son served zero purpose. Fighting over the ashes of his wealth management firm would not save him from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The regional bankers would not bail him out. The local politicians would deny ever knowing his name. I remained the only entity in the room possessing the power, the capital, and the unyielding authority to halt the execution. I owned Aegis Capital. I controlled the escrow accounts holding his stolen $15 million. I commanded the digital guillotine hovering inches above his neck. Victor abandoned the final. Fragile shreds of his towering ego, the patriarch who spent decades demanding absolute submission, the man who poured expensive scotch and mocked my archivist's salary just 72 hours prior, completely discarded his pride. He dropped to his hands and knees. He did not stand up. He did not walk. He crawled. He dragged his body across the polished marble floor. His bespoke tuxedo pants absorbed the spilled vintage champagne, the dark liquid soaking through the expensive wool, clinging wetly to his kneecaps. His polished leather shoes scraped awkwardly against the stone. He moved with the frantic, disjointed desperation of a drowning man clawing toward a life raft. He reached the bottom of the dais. He gripped the edge of the first carpeted step, hauling his upper body forward until he collapsed right at the base of my podium. He tilted his head back, staring up at me. Sweat poured down his forehead, matting his graying hair against his scalp. Tears mixed with the perspiration, streaming down his flushed, panicked face. "Nicole," Victor gasped, his voice a ragged, pathetic wheeze. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head rapidly. "Please, I am begging you. I will do anything. You have to stop this. You have to call off the audit." I stood perfectly still, looking down at his trembling form. I did not step away. "I will give you everything," Victor babbled, the words tumbling from his mouth in a frantic, unstructured flood. "I will sign over the wealth management firm tonight. You can have the entire portfolio. I will give you the suburban mansion. I will transfer the titles to the cars. Take it all. Just clear the escrow accounts and tell them it was a corporate restructuring error. Tell them you authorized the leverage. Please, Nicole. I cannot go to federal prison. I will not survive it. Take everything I own." He pressed his forehead against the carpeted step, weeping openly, surrendering his entire fabricated empire in exchange for his freedom. He offered me his crown, entirely oblivious to the fact that his kingdom had already burned to ash. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer him a sympathetic nod. I opened the brass clasp of my simple, structured clutch. I bypassed my identification. I slid my fingers around the edge of a sleek, matte black, heavy stock folder I prepared hours before stepping into the penthouse elevator. I pulled the folder free. I held it suspended over the edge of the mahogany podium. I released my grip. The folder plummeted downward. It struck the marble floor directly in front of Victor's face with a sharp, resounding smack. Victor flinched, startled by the sudden noise. He raised his head, blinking rapidly to clear the tears from his vision. He stared at the black folder. His trembling fingers reached out, hooking the edge of the heavy cover. He pulled it open. The stark white documents inside bore the official seals of the federal bankruptcy courts and the corporate acquisition boards. Victor's eyes darted frantically across the legal text. He read the liquidation orders. He read the immediate asset seizure directives triggered by his massive margin calls and his insolvent operating accounts. The documents outlined the complete, involuntary dissolution of his wealth management firm, the immediate foreclosure of his highly leveraged suburban mansion, and the repossession of his leased European sports cars. The paperwork detailed the hostile takeover executed by Aegis Capital, purchasing his toxic debt for pennies on the dollar strictly to mandate his forced liquidation. His breathing stopped. The pathetic, frantic babbling died in his throat. He looked up at me, his face completely devoid of color, his mind finally processing the absolute totality of his ruin. I gripped the edges of the podium. I leaned forward, closing the physical distance between my position and his kneeling form. I lowered my head, ensuring my voice remained a lethal, isolated whisper intended solely for his ears. "You have absolutely nothing left to offer me, Victor," I whispered, the words slicing through the remaining oxygen in his lungs. "I already purchased your toxic debt. I already foreclosed on your mansion. I own your entire future. And I am leaving you with nothing but a federal cage." The heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the grand ballroom did not simply open. They shattered the stagnant, suffocating air, slammed backward by immense physical force. The brass handles crashed against the marble walls, the percussive impact echoing off the vaulted, frescoed ceiling like a detonated explosive. A coordinated, massive strike force poured across the threshold. Men and women wearing dark, durable tactical windbreakers bearing the stark, yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation surged into the venue. Investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission, clad in austere, unyielding charcoal suits, flanked the federal agents. They moved with absolute, synchronized military precision, forming a rigid tactical wedge that carved directly through the center of the room. They did not care about the bespoke tuxedos, the dripping diamonds, or the imported caviar circulating on silver trays. Their heavy combat boots struck the polished stone, tracking grit over the pristine floor, establishing undeniable, total jurisdiction over the space. The 200 elite guests scrambled. The regional bankers, the tech founders, and the society heirs pressed their backs flat against the velvet window curtains, sucking in their stomachs, attempting to dissolve into the architecture. They abandoned their cocktail tables, dropping their crystal champagne flutes, ensuring no federal agent mistook them for an obstacle. A senior special agent spearheaded the formation. He possessed a rigid jawline and cold, scanning eyes completely devoid of any negotiation. He bypassed the terrified aristocrats, his gaze locked like a laser targeting system onto the illuminated circle at the base of the elevated dais. Victor remained collapsed on the floor, his sweaty forehead hovering inches above the black bankruptcy folder. Bryce cowered 3 yards away, huddled near the carved falcon ice sculpture, his velvet dinner jacket stained with his own terrified perspiration. The lead agent did not introduce himself. He did not offer a polite, bureaucratic greeting. He halted his stride exactly 2 feet away from my stepfather. 2 tactical officers flanked the senior agent, instantly unclipping heavy steel restraints from their reinforced duty belts. "Victor," the agent barked, his voice projecting a lethal, uncompromising baritone over the dead silence of the ballroom. You are under federal arrest for severe wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and massive, repeated securities violations. The tactical officers surged forward. They did not ask Victor to stand. They grabbed him by the shoulders of his bespoke tuxedo, hauling his dead weight off the carpeted steps with rough, unyielding force. They twisted his arms behind his back, the sharp mechanical ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed sharply across the cavernous space, a brutal metallic click that permanently terminated his freedom. Victor did not resist. His spine turned to jelly. His chin dropped, resting heavily against his chest. His knees buckled, forcing the two agents to physically support his entire body weight just to keep him upright. Simultaneously, a secondary tactical team descended upon Bryce. Bryce threw his hands into the air, pressing his back flush against the ice sculpture table. "I did not authorize the transfers," Bryce shrieked, his voice cracking into a pathetic, feral whine. "I did not handle the escrow accounts. It was him. Take my father." The federal agents ignored his frantic, cowardly defense. They closed the distance, grabbing his wrists. Bryce thrashed, attempting to pull his arms away. The lead officer shoved him face first against the table. The violent impact rattled the carved ice falcon, launching a spray of freezing water across Bryce's cheek and ruining the lapel of his velvet jacket. The agent wrenched Bryce's arms backward, snapping the steel cuffs securely over his wrists. The senior agent stepped between the two prisoners, extracting a laminated card from his tactical vest. He began reciting the Miranda warning. His cadence remained rapid, monotonous, and absolute, stripping away their constitutional liberties line by line while the city's financial aristocracy watched in paralyzed horror. The sight of the steel restraints cutting into Bryce's wrists shattered Helen's paralysis. The woman who spent her entire life projecting refined, untouchable high society decorum completely snapped. Her golden child, the son she pampered, protected, and groomed to inherit a fabricated dynasty, was currently pinned against a table like a violent street criminal. Helen launched herself across the spilled vintage champagne. "Let him go!" Helen shrieked, the sound tearing violently at her vocal cords, her gold silk dress snagged under her heel, ripping the expensive seams. But she did not stop. She charged the tactical officer, restraining Bryce, throwing her arms out in a desperate, animalistic frenzy. She clawed at the agent's shoulders, digging her manicured nails into the durable nylon of the federal windbreaker, desperately trying to pry the man away from her son. He did nothing wrong. Take Victor. Bryce is innocent. Unhand him right now. Federal law enforcement officers do not negotiate with hysterical socialites. The tactical officer pivoted, absorbing her frantic blows. He broke her grip with a swift, brutal sweep of his forearm, knocking her hands away from his uniform. A female federal agent stepped instantly into the breach. She grabbed Helen by the upper arms, spinning the shrieking woman around with uncompromising force. The agent slammed Helen face first into a neighboring high-top cocktail table. The remaining champagne flutes tumbled over the edge, shattering into hundreds of razor-sharp shards against the marble. The agent pinned Helen's torso against the glass surface, pulling the struggling woman's arms firmly behind her back. She produced a third set of heavy steel handcuffs from her belt. "You are under arrest for assaulting a federal officer and active obstruction of justice," the female agent stated, her voice devoid of any sympathy as she ratcheted the cold metal around Helen's wrists. Helen gasped, her cheek pressed flat against the glass, her perfectly sprayed hair falling in a disheveled, chaotic mess across her face. She sobbed, struggling uselessly against the heavy restraints, her dignity and her freedom evaporating simultaneously. The senior agent signaled the extraction. The tactical teams gripped the elbows of their prisoners. They hauled Victor, Bryce, and Helen away from the dais, dragging them forcefully toward the heavy mahogany exit doors. The prisoners stumbled. Their polished leather shoes and expensive designer heels slid awkwardly across the marble, stripping them of any remaining physical grace. They marched the three handcuffed felons directly past Anna. My half-sister remained a crumpled, discarded heap of crimson silk on the floor. She wept into her palms, her shoulders shuddering violently, completely incapacitated by her own absolute ruin. Helen did not look down at her daughter as the agents dragged her past. Bryce did not call out to his sister, keeping his eyes squeezed tightly shut. Victor stared blankly ahead, a hollow, hyperventilating shell of a patriarch. They abandoned her utterly. They left her completely isolated in the wreckage of the empire they destroyed, proving that their toxic loyalty extended only as far as their own self-preservation. The agents pulled the 3 prisoners through the heavy brass doors, hauling them out of the luxury hotel, dragging them away from the chandeliers, the caviar, and the elite society, pulling them directly into the cold, unforgiving reality of the criminal justice system. The mahogany doors swung shut, sealing Anna alone on the ballroom floor. I remained standing behind the elevated mahogany podium. I did not move. I did not adjust my posture. I looked past the vacated center of the ballroom, focusing my gaze on the towering floor-to-ceiling windows lining the eastern wall. The dark glass reflected the city's streets, sitting 2 floors below. Bright, pulsing strobes of red and blue light bled through the fabric of the heavy velvet curtains, painting the ballroom's ceiling in erratic, violent flashes. Dozens of federal transport vans and local police cruisers idled outside the hotel, swallowing my stepfather, my biological mother, and my stepbrother into their reinforced steel cages. The catharsis washed over me. It was absolute. The psychological venom they pumped into my veins for decades, the constant belittling, the theft, the arrogant suppression, it all drained away, leaving behind a crisp, weightless, crystalline clarity, the coiled spring fully unspooled. Releasing the tension I carried since childhood, the ballroom remained locked in a state of dead, breathless silence for 30 consecutive seconds. The 200 elite guests stared at the empty space near the ice sculpture where the arrogant wealth managers stood just moments prior. They processed the sheer, devastating velocity of the execution. They realized they had just witnessed a sovereign power obliterate a parasitic threat without raising her voice a single decibel. Then, movement breached the absolute stillness. Elias Thorne stepped forward from the periphery of the crowd. He planted his feet near the center of the room, directly facing the elevated dais. He raised his hands. He struck his palms together. A single. Sharp clap echoed off the frescoed ceiling. He struck his palms again, slow, deliberate, and deeply respectful. A regional bank president standing near the velvet curtains raised his hands, joining the rhythm. A tech founder on the opposite side of the room followed suit. The society heirs, the politicians, and the corporate executives stepped away from the walls. Within 10 seconds, all 200 elite guests stepped forward. They clapped their hands, creating a unified, thunderous, rolling applause that vibrated through the floorboards of the grand ballroom. They looked up at the podium, their faces devoid of their usual arrogance, offering absolute, unquestioned submission to the architect of the execution. Saturday, October 17th, the digital clock mounted above the federal intake desk shifted to exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. The Federal Detention Center, situated in the downtown district, offered a brutal, jarring contrast to the crystal chandeliers and velvet curtains of the luxury hotel ballroom. Here, the architecture served a singular purpose: absolute containment. The air tasted of industrial bleach, oxidized iron, and stale sweat. Harsh, caged fluorescent tubes emitted a relentless, buzzing hum, casting sickly, pale light over the cinder block walls. I stood at the security checkpoint. I surrendered my coat, my watch, and my structured clutch to the intake guard, retaining only a single, heavy stock manila envelope. The guard stamped my visitor pass and gestured toward the reinforced sally port. The heavy steel gates clanged shut behind me, a sequence of mechanical deadbolts engaging with deep, percussive thuds that vibrated through the concrete floor. I followed a silent, armed corrections officer down a long, windowless corridor. My heels clicked a sharp, metronomic rhythm, echoing down the sterile hallway, announcing the arrival of the executioner. The guard stopped outside interrogation room number 4. He unlocked the heavy steel door, pulling it open. I stepped across the threshold. The room featured 0 windows, a scratched stainless steel table bolted directly to the linoleum floor, and 2 rigid metal chairs. Victor sat in the far chair. The physical deterioration he suffered overnight was staggering. The man who spent decades projecting an aura of refined, aristocratic invincibility aged 20 years in a span of 12 hours. The bespoke, satin lapel tuxedo was gone, replaced by a stiff, neon orange federal jumpsuit. The rough cotton fabric bunched awkwardly around his neck, stripping away his commanding silhouette. He lacked his styling gel. His graying hair fell in thin, chaotic clumps across his sweaty forehead. Deep, bruised bags hung beneath his bloodshot, exhausted eyes. His hands, resting on the cold steel table, trembled constantly, causing the short metal chain connecting his handcuffs to his waist restrictor to clink sharply against the metal surface. He looked up as the heavy door slammed shut. A fleeting, pathetic spark of desperate hope ignited in his sunken eyes. His delusional mind, fractured by the sheer velocity of his downfall, immediately fabricated a lifeline. He saw me standing there, unescorted by federal agents, holding a manila envelope, and he assumed I arrived as a sympathetic daughter offering salvation. He believed I brought Aegis Capital attorneys to negotiate his bail, to cover his massive margin calls, and to salvage his burning reputation. I pulled the metal chair back. The legs scraped harshly against the linoleum. I sat down opposite him. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not offer a greeting. "Nicole," Victor rasped, his voice a dry, broken wheeze. He leaned forward, dragging his shackled wrists across the table. "You came. I knew you would not leave me in here. The agents took everything. They froze the corporate accounts. They seized the house. You have to tell Elias Thorne to post the bond. We can fix the escrow deficit. We can structure a repayment plan. I can transfer the remaining client portfolios directly to your fund." He remained entirely consumed by his own arrogance, attempting to broker a business deal while chained to a table in a federal holding facility. I placed the manila envelope onto the scratched metal surface. I untwisted the red string securing the flap. I extracted a stack of crisp, densely typed legal documents bearing the corporate watermark of Aegis Capital alongside the blind embossed seal of the Federal Bankruptcy Court. I slid the papers across the table, stopping them exactly 1 inch from his trembling fingertips. Victor stared at the documents. His bloodshot eyes darted across the bold, capitalized headers, confirmation of hostile acquisition and total asset liquidation. "I did not come to negotiate your bail, Victor," I stated, my voice echoing flat and clinical against the concrete walls. "I came to deliver the final receipt." He blinked rapidly, struggling to process the dense legal text through his sleep-deprived, panicked state. He looked from the papers to my face, his jaw slacking. "At 8 o'clock this morning, Aegis Capital officially absorbed the entirety of your wealth management firm," I explained, dissecting his ruined empire with surgical precision. "We purchased your toxic debt for fractions of a penny. We seized your primary operating accounts. We assumed total executive control over your corporate entity." Victor opened his mouth, drawing a ragged, rattling breath. You bought the firm. You are taking over the operations." "We did not buy it to operate it," I corrected, ensuring the absolute finality of the maneuver crushed his remaining hope. "I authorized immediate, total liquidation. My auditors are currently in your building. They are selling off the mahogany desks, stripping the servers, auctioning the leased vehicles, and dissolving the client lists. The signage bearing your name is currently being pried off the exterior brickwork. We are tearing your legacy down to the copper wiring." He stared at me, paralyzed by the sheer, devastating scale of the erasure. "The capital generated from the liquidation is not going into my pockets," I continued, leaning slightly forward, projecting my voice across the few inches separating us. "The funds are being routed directly to the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. We are covering the massive deficits you created when you illegally drained the fiduciary trusts. Aegis Capital is making your elderly clients whole. We are restoring their retirement portfolios, entirely erasing the financial damage you inflicted upon them." Victor's chest hitched. The reality of his situation breached his final psychological defense. The wealth management firm represented his entire identity. It fueled his arrogance, funded his country club memberships, and justified his towering superiority complex. And now, it simply ceased to exist. I wiped his name from the financial sector completely. Tears breached his bloodshot eyes. They spilled over his eyelashes, carving clean tracks through the grime and sweat on his pale cheeks. He dropped his head, burying his face in his trembling hands. The steel chains clattered violently against the table. He sobbed. The sound emerged as a wet, guttural wail bouncing off the windowless walls. "It was the pressure, Nicole." Victor wept, his voice muffled behind his palms, frantically attempting to rationalize his sociopathy. "You do not understand the expectations. The regional bankers, the society galas, the overhead of the mansion. It costs a fortune just to maintain the image. Bryce lost the real estate capital. The margin calls threatened to expose us. I had to maintain our status. I had to survive. The society demands it. I only took the escrow funds to buy us time to secure the partnership with you." He shifted the blame, weaponizing self-pity, attempting to construct a narrative where the oppressive demands of elite society forced his hand. He blamed his incompetent son. He blamed the cost of his own luxury. He wanted absolution. I kept my hands folded. I did not raise my voice. I did not validate his pathetic excuses. "Society did not force you to forge my signature in the middle of the night," I stated, my tone dropping to a cold, unyielding whisper that cut directly through his sobbing. "Society did not force you to steal $15 million from a dead man's estate. Society did not force you to drain the life savings of vulnerable investors to fund your leased sports cars." Victor lowered his hands, looking at me with red, swollen eyes, moisture dripping from his chin. "Your greed was your own deliberate choice," I concluded, staring into the hollow remnants of his soul. "You trampled every boundary. You viewed everyone around you as disposable collateral for your own elevation. You desperately wanted to reside in an impenetrable fortress. Victor, look around. You built the exact concrete cage you are currently sitting in." I did not wait for a rebuttal. I placed my hands on the table and pushed myself up. The metal chair scraped loudly against the linoleum. Victor lunged forward, pressing his chest against the edge of the table. The waist chain snapped taut, halting his momentum. "Nicole, do not leave me here. You cannot leave me in this place. They are charging me with federal wire fraud. I will die in a penitentiary. Helen will not survive." I turned my back to the table. I walked toward the heavy steel door. I raised my hand and knocked twice against the reinforced glass observation window. "Nicole!" Victor screamed, his voice cracking into a desperate, feral shriek. He slammed his handcuffed fists against the scratched metal table. "I am your family!" The lock disengaged with a loud, mechanical thud. The guard pulled the heavy door open, clearing the threshold. I stepped out of the interrogation room, crossing the doorway. I did not look back over my shoulder. I walked down the long, windowless concrete corridor, letting the heavy steel door slam shut, sealing the echo of his hysterical sobbing permanently behind me. Fast forward 6 months to April 2027. The freezing winter thawed, carrying away the final, fragile remnants of Victor's fabricated dynasty. The ensuing fallout did not resemble a dramatic, televised legal battle. It functioned as a systematic, bureaucratic eradication. Faced with the impenetrable fortress of federal evidence, the forged digital signatures, the unauthorized offshore routing nodes, and the recorded dinner table confessions, the expensive defense attorneys Victor initially hired quickly abandoned any strategy of claiming innocence. They reviewed the thick federal dossiers, recognized the absolute impossibility of an acquittal, and advised immediate, unconditional surrender. Victor and Bryce sat at a scarred wooden defense table inside the federal courthouse. They wore loose, faded khaki jumpsuits bearing the stencil of the Regional Detention Center, a jarring, pathetic departure from the tailored velvet and silk they previously utilized to project dominance. They did not argue with the prosecutors. They did not raise their voices in defiance. They gripped cheap plastic pens and signed the heavy stacks of plea agreements. They traded their right to a public trial, capitulating entirely to avoid the maximum statutory penalties. The federal judge delivered the sentence without a fraction of mercy, condemning their malicious violation of fiduciary trusts and aggressive wire fraud. The wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, definitive crack. 15-year sentences. The transport buses carried the father and son away from the city skyline, depositing them into a medium-security federal penitentiary. The transition stripped away their identities completely. Victor, the man who spent decades demanding absolute submission from regional bankers, now obeyed the barking commands of armed corrections officers. He slept on a thin, lumpy mattress resting on a cold steel slab. He shuffled through sterile, concrete corridors, holding a compartmentalized plastic tray, waiting in line for flavorless, mass-produced meals. The towering superiority complex he wielded like a weapon collapsed, leaving a hollow, aging man staring blankly at cinder-block walls. Bryce, the aggressive corporate climber who mocked my archivist's salary, discovered the brutal, unforgiving reality of his new hierarchy. He kept his eyes locked firmly on his scuffed canvas shoes during yard time. He shrank against the chain-link fences, entirely terrified of the hardened felons surrounding him. The velvet dinner jackets and luxury watches evaporated, leaving behind a weak, hyperventilating shell of a man who flinched violently at the sound of a closing cell door. While the federal prison system swallowed the men, the financial ruin consumed the women. The federal bankruptcy courts executed the liquidation orders with ruthless, mechanical efficiency. The heavily leveraged suburban mansion transitioned into the property of a commercial asset recovery firm. Movers carrying heavy dollies boxed up the custom furniture, dismantled the crystal chandeliers, and towed the leased European sports cars away from the circular driveway. Auctioning the assets to compensate the elderly clients, Victor defrauded. I, Helen, stripped of her stolen wealth and her matriarchal throne, received a mandated non-negotiable eviction notice. She packed her remaining, court-approved personal items into 3 small cardboard boxes. She relocated to the industrial outskirts of the city, signing a lease for a cramped, drafty studio apartment situated above a noisy commercial laundromat. The sprawling marble foyers she once dominated contracted into a single room, smelling of stale cooking oil, industrial bleach, and peeling linoleum. She survived on a meager fixed income, counting physical coins at the checkout line to purchase generic, processed groceries. Helen sat at a cheap, folding card table, staring out a small, grimy window overlooking a brick alleyway. She spent her days clutching a faded, printed photograph of her former estate, tracing the edges of the paper, mourning the silk dresses and country club luncheons that defined her entire existence. She possessed no servants to command, no guests to impress, and no golden sun to protect. She lived in absolute, suffocating isolation, crushed under the weight of her own shallow complicity. Anna experienced a distinct, agonizing psychological torture. The high society circles she worshipped, the elite heiresses she considered peers, executed a flawless, unified excommunication. The country clubs revoked her memberships. The charity boards erased her name from their registries. Her wealthy fiancé vanished completely, leaving her marooned in the wreckage of the federal scandal. Lacking the stolen capital to fund her revolving credit accounts, Anna faced the brutal necessity of basic survival. The woman who paraded through ballrooms dripping in leveraged diamonds now stood behind a cheap, particle board concession counter. She secured a minimum wage job scanning tickets at a local, high-end movie theater downtown. She wore a stiff, polyester uniform polo shirt and a plastic name tag pinned carelessly to her chest. A frayed, nylon lanyard replaced the heavy diamond collars. Her shifts aligned with the evening rush, placing her directly in the path of the city's affluent residents. She stood near the carpeted entrance, holding a digital barcode scanner. She watched the wealthy patrons walk past the velvet stanchions, breathing in the artificial scent of popcorn, butter, and floor wax. One Friday evening, A group of prominent socialites women Anna previously invited to exclusive luncheons approached the podium. They wore the exact designer garments Anna used to purchase on credit. They laughed effortlessly, carrying expensive leather handbags, their wrists glittering with authentic stones. Anna froze. Her hands gripped the plastic scanner tightly. She lowered her head, desperately attempting to hide her face behind the brim of her uniform visor. The lead socialite stopped at the podium, extending her smartphone to display the digital tickets. She glanced at the employee. Recognition flashed across the socialite's face. The polite, automated smile dissolved into a mask of cold. Unadulterated pity. She did not offer a greeting. She did not speak Anna's name. She simply held the phone closer, treating my half-sister as an invisible, unfortunate fixture of the building. Anna's hand trembled violently as she raised the scanner. The red laser swept across the screen. The machine emitted a sharp, electronic beep. Anna lowered the device, stepping aside to clear the path. The socialites walked past her, their expensive perfume lingering in the air, a phantom reminder of the life she threw away. Anna gripped the edge of the podium, her throat burning, hot tears pricking the corners of her eyes. She remained trapped in a purgatory of her own design, forced to serve the exact people she desperately sought to rule, tormented daily by the catastrophic consequences of her own shallow arrogance. Back in the financial district, the physical footprint of their fake empire ceased to exist entirely. The commercial office space Victor occupied sat empty for exactly 2 weeks before a legitimate accounting firm signed the lease. Contractors arrived with heavy steel drills, unbolting the brass plaque bearing Victor's name from the exterior brickwork. They tossed the heavy metal into an industrial dumpster, discarding his legacy like common refuse. The name no longer commanded respect, fear, or attention. It served exclusively as a grim cautionary tale. Inside the boardrooms of rival equity firms and the secluded corners of exclusive steakhouses, executives whispered about the swift, total annihilation of the arrogant wealth manager and his impulsive son. They discussed the sheer, breathtaking stupidity of attempting to defraud Aegis Capital. They analyzed the absolute, lethal precision of the digital trap that ensnared them. Victor and Bryce became the definitive example of catastrophic greed. Their downfall reminded the city's financial aristocracy that true power did not stem from loud boasts, leased sports cars, or forged signatures. True power operated in the shadows, struck without warning, and left nothing but scorched earth in its wake. Their fake empire reduced to dust, scattered into the wind, completely and permanently forgotten. The heavy motorized glass doors of the penthouse retracted, sliding soundlessly into the reinforced walls. I stepped onto the wraparound terrace. The crisp, high-altitude wind whipped across the concrete, catching the hem of my tailored trench coat. I walked to the edge of the parapet and wrapped my hands around the cold steel railing. The temperature grounded me in the immediate, physical reality of my supremacy. I looked out over the sprawling city skyline. A vast, illuminated grid of arteries and towering concrete monuments stretched toward the horizon. The Aegis Capital headquarters pierced the clouds directly in my line of sight. A monolith of glass and steel casting a long, dominant shadow over the financial district. I no longer viewed that building from the suffocating confines of a subterranean basement. I no longer breathed the stale, recycled air of the Historical Society archives, the oversized, drab wool cardigans, and the scuffed, sensible flat shoes rested permanently in an incinerator. Discarded relics of a camouflage I no longer required, I operated in the blinding, undeniable light of the summit. Elias Thorne stepped onto the terrace. His leather shoes clicked sharply against the paving stones. He bypassed the customary pleasantries, extending a sleek, titanium tablet toward my hands. I took the device. I did not hide my keystrokes. I did not mask my digital footprint behind complex proxy networks or ghost servers. Aegis Capital functioned entirely in the open, and the global financial sector knew exactly who commanded the ledger. I swiped across the screen, reviewing the quarterly capital allocations. My fingers traced the numbers, dissecting the data with the same forensic precision I utilized to dismantle my stepfather's fraudulent empire. We purged the predatory commercial real estate portfolios that Bryce previously favored. We liquidated every single toxic asset that defined Victor's fabricated, highly leveraged existence. In their place, I authorized massive capital injections to fund genuine, ethical innovation. I pressed my biometric signature to the screen, authorizing a $50 million grant to advance sustainable agricultural technology in depleted rural sectors. I navigated to the secondary portfolio and approved a $120 million infrastructure initiative designed to revitalize the city's crumbling industrial foundations. I routed capital to build, to fortify, and to elevate communities, actively erasing the parasitic financial practices my family previously utilized to drain them. Elias retrieved the tablet, bowing his head in a gesture of absolute, unyielding loyalty. He turned and retreated into the penthouse, leaving me alone with the howling wind and the glittering expanse of the city. I turned my gaze toward the eastern horizon. The sun crested the distant hills, painting the morning sky in vibrant streaks of crimson and gold. The psychological chains forged by my biological mother and my stepfather, the constant barrage of belittling remarks, the manufactured isolation, the endless demands for my absolute subservience lay shattered on the marble floor of that luxury hotel ballroom. They spent decades attempting to convince me I was a useless burden, a naive, struggling archivist entirely incapable of understanding the sophisticated mechanics of their world. They projected their own profound, pathetic inadequacies onto my silence. I absorbed their venom for years, compressing the psychological tension until the immense pressure pulverized their entire reality. The invisible, silent ghost died. The architect breathed. The overarching narrative woven through the destruction of Victor's fraudulent dynasty illuminates one of the most painful, yet ultimately liberating lessons a person can master. Your inherent self-worth is never dictated by the individuals who actively refuse to acknowledge it, even if those individuals share your bloodline. For years, I hid my immense wealth, my unparalleled intellect, and my global influence behind a carefully constructed facade. I muted my own brilliance, subconsciously harboring a desperate, fragile hope that if I demanded nothing, if I occupied zero space, the toxic family I belonged to might eventually offer a fraction of genuine respect. Yet, diminishing your own light to comfort the fragile egos of manipulative people never secures their loyalty. It only invites their exploitation. They do not view your silent endurance as peace. They view it as a vulnerability waiting to be breached. Victor, Bryce, Helen, and Anna operated under the arrogant delusion that my quiet compliance equated to profound weakness. They trampled every conceivable boundary. They forged my signature and attempted to steal the legacy of my biological father because they believed I lacked the capacity to strike back. They assumed my silence signaled defeat. The true turning point arrives the exact second you relinquish the desperate hope for their validation. True empowerment begins the moment you stop accepting the false narratives manipulators project onto you. When I sat at Victor's mahogany dining table, listening to him brag about his federal wire fraud, I did not react with chaotic, emotional vengeance. I did not scream or hurl accusations. I reclaimed the identity I buried. I weaponized my silence, my resilience, and my razor-sharp forensic intellect. I audited their crimes, built a flawless digital execution order, and let their own towering arrogance lead them directly into a federal cage. We often compromise our boundaries to keep the peace. We tolerate the insults. We endure the theft of our time, our energy, and our tangible assets, operating under the deeply flawed assumption that familial ties guarantee immunity from total betrayal. My journey shatters that assumption completely. Authentic relationships build upon a solid foundation of mutual respect, not subjugation, gaslighting, and theft. Establishing firm boundaries and walking away from a toxic environment does not constitute an act of cruelty. It serves as an essential, non-negotiable act of self-preservation. When you strip away the masks you wear to appease toxic relatives, you finally discover the unshakable foundation of your own power. Authentic success relies entirely upon uncompromising integrity and unyielding self-worth. It does not stem from stolen wealth, forged digital signatures, or heavily leveraged diamonds purchased on credit to impress strangers in a hotel ballroom. True security rests exclusively in your own capabilities, your intellect, your discipline, and your refusal to accept disrespect place you far beyond the reach of those who seek only to drag you down into their suffocating mediocrity. You cannot control the malice others harbor, but you possess absolute, dictatorial control over what you are willing to tolerate. If you have ever had to walk away from people who actively tried to dim your light, how did you finally reclaim your power? How did you draw that massive line in the sand and execute your own justice? Share your story in the comments below. Your experiences matter, and your strength serves as a vital blueprint for someone else currently fighting their own battle in the shadows. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more stories of absolute justice, and thank you for watching. Stay strong.